Hello and welcome to the EIC Clearly podcast. EIC Clearly? See what I did there? This is the podcast that brings you in-depth discussions with energy, policy and thought leaders on the most critical issues, trends and innovations shaping the global energy supply chain.
Hi everybody, it's Stuart Broadley from EIC here and welcome to another EIC Clearly podcast. I am here today in beautiful Hamburg with someone who I've known for a long time but not seen for a while, which is Andreas Nauen. Hi Andreas, how are you?
I'm doing fine, Stuart, and really nice to see you after such a long time.
Absolutely. So Andreas is operating partner with Sandbrook Capital, which invests into energy transition across the whole value chain, particularly in the US, in Europe. And we'll talk a bit about that part of your life. But the reason I'm also particularly interested to see Andreas again after all this time is because of his illustrious career. Is that okay to say you have an illustrious career? It's quite nice.
I always admired that your English was so much better than mine, Stuart. And if illustrious, if I translate it into German, it's actually probably a different meaning. But
what would be the right German word? That would
no, it's illustrious is fine. I'm fine. I'm fine.
So Andreas was CEO of Siemens Wind twice, but we know each other because he was CEO of REpower, which then became Senvion, which is now part of Siemens Energy's wind business through a long series of transactions that we might talk about today. But from about 2010 to 2013, I was running the global service business for REpower when Andreas was CEO there. And so I have very happy memories of those times. And I think everybody that was around REpower at that time would say that was a highlight of their career. And we'll talk about kind of how to create great culture and what makes a great business. But also in this discussion, we're going to talk about, sort of looking back, successes, failures, impact and reflections on leadership, on policy, how energy transition in the wind industry is doing today, and many other things. So I suppose overall, you've been in the wind industry for 22 years. You've been in the energy industry for 35 years. And ultimately, I think you would regard yourself as a green advocate. So with that context, Andreas, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Where do you want to start? How are you today? And what are you focusing on today?
I'm actually excited. It's my first podcast in life. And this is also maybe a good example of what still energizes me. I can still, even though I have been doing this for a very long time, I can still discover new things. And last week I did a live stream. This week I'm doing my first podcast. And it's all around energy. Everything that I do is around energy. It's about green energy. It's about renewables. And in a different life now than in my CEO life that you referred to a few times. So I have now what I would call a portfolio life of different things, but all in green energy, and I still like that.
Let's start with Siemens Energy, which is what is now called today the wind business, which you've got a long association with, but you actually started out in Siemens before they had a wind business, I guess. Is that right? So this was go right back to where you started in the energy industry.
Yeah, I started actually in the fossil division of, at that time, Siemens AG, Siemens Power Generation, building combined cycle power stations, selling combined cycles power station actually in the UK or in Germany and other parts of Europe. And then I was 2 years in charge of the strategy of Siemens Power Generation. And we then decided as Siemens to invest into green technology, wind power, and at that time we bought a wonderful Danish company called Bonus, and then I became the CEO of that when we started it.
And when was that?
That was in 2004, end of 2004. The big gas turbine boom was behind us. We needed an extra leg to stand on in Siemens Power Generation, and it was very obvious at the time that would be renewables, and at that time it was wind.
Why did you say it was obvious at the time? This was because it was all that everybody was talking about, or was it the COP process, or why was wind power booming or about to boom?
The energy industry goes through cycles. You have a nuclear cycle, at least in the Western world, a fossil, coal, gas, oil. And at that time, renewable energy, also driven especially by a few countries like Germany, like the US, was starting. And we saw this as a big opportunity for a growth business in Siemens Power Generation. And that's why I invested into that.
And Would you look back and say it was a successful investment? One of the things I wanted to talk to you about today was kind of lessons of when do deals go well, not well? What are the lessons around what makes a good outcome? And when I reflect on my career, I think often around, do I measure myself on whether it was a good decision or a bad decision, or whether in the end it was a good outcome or a bad outcome? How do you approach things like that?
The history of Siemens Wind Power, which later turned into Siemens Gamesa, is of course, how do I say it politely, maybe colorful. And if I look at the first 5, 6, maybe even 10 years, it was a huge success. We were able to combine the fantastic technology that the Danish company came with, making great wind turbines, combining that with a global sales political execution power of Siemens. And we grew the company tenfold from around 300 million revenue and so profitable into a really profitable multi-billion company with several thousand people starting from 800. So the first few years were clearly a great success. If you now, of course, look at today and also the last few years of Siemens Gamesa with all their troubles, that has reasons not originating in the old history, that has different reasons. But overall, I still think it was a great thing for Siemens to invest into green technology.
When you look back on that, what was your role in that process? I mean, were you CEO? So you kind of started up the wind business then?
Yeah. And I became the CEO on the day of the acquisition and forming the team from a fantastic technology team, from finding a COO that really knows how to manufacture these things in large volumes, from salespeople that can go out into the world, just forming that team, defining the way forward, getting the right people on the bus, being in the driver's seat of the bus, but having the best people, I believe, of that industry in my bus and then driving the Siemens Wind bus forward. That is how I would define the task that I had.
What was the situation then and then where you were sort of lured to come to REpower? What was the circumstances of why you decided to move?
Like probably in your career decisions and everyone's career decisions, there's always an attracting element of doing something new and also of an element that has to do with your situation. And I've been running that business for 5, nearly 6 years at the time in Siemens. And the first discussions came up, should I do something else? But honestly, I didn't want to do anything else. I really like and still like today this renewables industry. And then the opportunity came up, actually driven by a fascinating person, Mr. Tulsi Tanti, the owner, chairman, the everything of Suzlon. He had already acquired REpower and he wanted to merge Suzlon and REpower and form a global wind turbine company with me as a CEO getting listed somewhere in Europe. And this I saw as a great opportunity, using the knowledge I had, but for the first time in my life, not running a business unit, but running my own company. And this was then the opportunity I took.
He must have been very persuasive because you had a great job, as you say, tenfold growth of the Siemens Wind business. But he was very persuasive, wasn't he? I remember Tulsi so well. He's sadly, of course, no longer with us. But he was a very inspirational leader and a visionary leader, wasn't he? And a very influential negotiator. How would you sum up Tulsi?
I've met a few people in my life, and only very few make the top list where I say, these are outstanding, world-changing people. And Tulsi Tanti was one of them. Why was he one of them? His ambition was already at that time, more than 20 years ago, to do something against climate change. And he was driven by that. He was also driven by doing good for his country, bringing electricity and wealth to India. And that drive combined with also the foresight, I can't just do it out of India. I need to combine it with a world-class Western technology. That was something that I saw as a great idea, and it was fascinating to work with such a person. He was also a very down-to-earth person. I remember talking very private family things with him. And probably a career highlight was when my wife and I were invited to his son's wedding, a 3-day 1,000 people festival, and I had as a guest 7 different outfits. Can you imagine walking around with the turban? It was amazing.
But it wasn't always easy either, was it, with Tulsi? So I remember Tulsi very well for lots of things. I'm going to do something now which doesn't work very well on podcasts, which is I'm going to explain how he viewed strategy and moving forward. So he was a very visionary guy, let's say. I would say he's very strategic. You say even visionary, I think. But if you imagine, I'm now putting my arms outside towards me, kind of somewhere like a cross. And I remember he would stand on stage trying to explain to people, I regard vision as long as you're going forward, it doesn't matter if you're going to the left or the right, it means you're not going backwards. That's progress. And that's how he viewed vision, right? And that's fine. But in the end, sometimes it ended up, didn't it, with distraction or with not always clarity for everybody on what are we doing and why are we doing this?
That's a very good observation, Stuart. And this probably was also the trouble he had. With all his visionary skills, not I think the greatest talent to turn that into reality. And also his expectations for REpower were sometimes beyond anything we could ever achieve. Let's say he expected us to be the global leader in offshore wind, which was super hard considering our financial situation and ownership. And that was probably his major trouble, translating his great vision into reality. And that was always the discussion I had with him. I said, Tulsi, why don't we divide it a little? You fly up in the sky, you meet all these politicians, you go to Davos, and the day-to-day job of running your wind turbine companies, you leave to me. I think I'm good at that. I've proven that it works. Why don't we divide the world? Yes, we'll do, Andreas, but let me explain. You don't understand. A famous phrase that I heard so often from him, but nevertheless, I think it describes Tulsi extremely well. When we were sold to Centerbridge, I called him, actually asking Tulsi, now finally you can rescue Suzlon with all the money you get now from Centerbridge. And I asked him, is it a good day for you? And he actually answered the opposite. It's a very sad day, Andreas. My dream is gone. My dream of building a world-class wind turbine company. Yes, I can rescue Suzlon, but what is that compared to my original dream? So that explains again what type of person he was.
Yeah, and so let's quickly do a recap. So Suzlon, so actually it started out, they were a clothing company originally, and he was trying to work out how to get a power system set up for his factory, and he installed his first wind turbine, which he didn't understand anything about the technology. It was just that's the way he was powering his clothing company. And that was it. He was like completely addicted suddenly to renewable power, abandoned his clothing business, focused fully on renewable technology, became very rapidly India's biggest wind turbine company, onshore only. And then he looked at REpower as a high technology, German, global, onshore and offshore wind turbine company. And I think that was what it seemed to me. Anyway, he was really interested. He was bringing together this, if you want to call it, low-cost onshore capability with amazing supply chains in India with this high technology, particularly offshore wind capability, more global. Pull those two together. Imagine you then got low-cost and high technology, onshore and offshore. That would be unique. And that was his vision, right?
I think that's already beyond the vision. That's already a strategy, because combining markets, combining technologies, merging two companies, seeing the value in that merger, and actually that was a strategy which unfortunately for financial reasons in the end didn't work out. But that's exactly the plan he had. And he was working on that plan at least for 5, 6, 7 years steadily.
One of the things I remember before we move on from this part of the story is it didn't work out, and we should probably talk about why it didn't work out, lessons from that. But also, there was a kind of a blindness he had with his vision, even though the practicalities of could he actually acquire that German business from the German banks, or would they permit it? He was stubbornly decisive and committed and determined to make this happen. But in the end, it felt like it was never going to happen. And a lot of time was lost and a lot of energy was put into, I guess, almost trying to convince the Suzlon team that we can work together, but it could never be 100% takeover. And that was very destructive in the end. Is that fair?
Maybe first the ultra-short version of why it didn't happen. the financing structure of REpower didn't allow us, due to the ring fencing we had, to fully merge with Suzlon. And at the same time, Suzlon was in huge financial troubles at the time. That was also the reason for the German bank.
Because they invested so much in the acquisition of REpower, in fact.
Was one reason. They could never recover the acquisition price that they had paid. And with that overpaid high debt at super high interest rates, money in India, at us doing well but never be able to fully repay that, banks didn't allow that. Also, the Indian banks didn't support that in the way they should or could have, and therefore, for purely financial reasons, that merger never took place. And that is indeed true, Stuart. We spent a lot of time trying to overcome these hurdles. We even had merger meetings, plannings, and all of that.
I remember merger meetings in Pune with lots of glamorous stage-based announcements of this is the new team, and it was, to me, a bizarre part of the process.
Yeah, but that was the one thing that we were always trying together with Suzlon, and some people believed in it, others gave up on the way. But there was also a parallel track of constantly trying to sell REpower. Actually, my very first day at REpower, July 1st, 2010, was not in the office in Hamburg. He asked me to fly to London to a potential buyer and meet with these people. I hadn't even seen the company. And that was for 4.5 years our constant work. I think in the end we had 3-4 very interested buyers, while at the same time still trying to merge. So that took a lot of time from management. On the other hand, I still believe that we in REpower, the 3,000 people that we had in factories and engineering, we ran a very solid wind turbine company at the time. You ran the service business. You really lifted the service business, which wasn't very developed at the time in wind. So we did the right operational thing and still had these two things up in the air all the time.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying this podcast and think you have an inspiring story to tell, contact me, Stuart Broadley, directly, as I would love to do a C-level podcast with you too. EIC is proud to be the UK's largest membership energy trade association and the 5th largest in the world. We are unique around the world for 3 reasons. We are truly energy agnostic, believing all energy technologies are vital to delivering energy security, affordability and a just transition. We are the only energy trade association anywhere in the world that offers a truly in-house one-stop shop for market intelligence, networks and events to help our members export, diversify and grow. And we are proud to be the voice of the energy supply chain, advocating for the 5 golden rules of a healthy energy supply chain. More details on EIC membership, the 5 golden rules, details about doing a future podcast with me, and how to contact us about anything else are in the description for this podcast.
Let's talk about REpower then, in terms of it was a brilliant business. Of course, the name had to change then to Senvion, and then ultimately it's now part of Siemens Energy. So that was a brilliant business, right? And you still meet people today who hark back to those, what they've described as happy days, great people, great culture. I remember the first time I met you, I think it was actually in, what do you call it? It's a kind of contract review meeting.
PCE, pre-contract evaluation. I still remember it.
You put in immediately a sort of pretty robust review process of every project that was being bid. And it immediately changed the culture of the business in a positive way. It put a little bit more rigor, a little bit more discipline into the way the business was being run. And it's kind of a lesson, I think, on culture change of how leaders can do that with simple, small changes in behavior and what an impact it had.
Yeah, there's what we call PCE at REpower. It's called LOA in Siemens. It's called a contract review process in other companies. For me, is a super essential tool because wind turbine companies or renewables companies in many, many cases are project companies. And with every project, your sales project, you determine your future. And therefore, deciding to make the right offers to your customers, which risk do you take, which price, which margin, and so on, is super essential decision for a wind turbine OEM. And therefore, also learning from my Siemens days, I introduced that process immediately because it structures the whole company. We want to win good and profitable orders. And if you add them up, the company will do fine. And that was my simple logic.
But that's often something maybe a COO would do or as a head of projects, but actually, no, as CEO, you made it your role. And it just set the tone for the whole company. And it's like, okay, Andreas is here and this is what he's like. And we like it. It needed it, actually, I think. So that was my first experience of you. Yeah, obviously, you're a brilliant storyteller and communicator. You always have been. But I'm interested in some of the reflections now on a business like that, which sadly, in the end, failed. What do you look back and think about? Are there decisions that could have been made around that time that would have changed the outcome? You know, whether it was the Suzlon, let's call it distraction, or was it the market that was just too competitive? Or was it perhaps something that I've always felt was a difficult decision to exit from, which is the determination by the business to be an offshore wind player as well as an onshore wind player? What's your view?
At first, it was indeed always difficult, shall we stay in offshore or not? And if in hindsight, what did I learn? And that is one of the learnings. If you are in a certain business, you should ask yourself 3 questions. Am I really passionate about it? I think we were in REpower, super passionate about it. The second thing is, can I really make money in that business? Yeah, I think we could. But the third question is also, and it's the ultimate question, can I be world class in that? Can I be the world leader? And to be honest, the size we had, and I was told that very clearly, one could also say bluntly, but very honestly by major clients. They said, Andreas, your turbine is fine, your people are fine, you have the largest turbine, but I cannot put a 4 or 5 billion investment on the back of your financial structure with the ownership you have. So we should have come to the conclusion that's not for us. Still, I believe the outcome of REpower is not an outcome because of Suzlon or offshore. It's the decisions that were taken by the company. And my usual example is Nordex, only 6 kilometers away, very similar in size. Okay, there were offshore, onshore, there's slight difference. But they made other decisions, and they are still here after all these years. REpower isn't there. So it was clearly not the market, it was the decisions that these companies took.
And just for people listening in, so Nordex, yes, is another German wind turbine company, still doing very well today. They had offshore and onshore, like REpower did, and they exited offshore wind around that time. It's around the early 2010s. And they got quite a lot of grief in the press about it. They were sort of seen as it was like a weak move. But in the end, they recovered very quickly and now, of course, have a great onshore wind business. So that's the point you're making. If you're a policy maker, there's this thing of policy trap, which is once you've stated, this is my policy and you voted me in to do it, it's always seen as a policy trap because things change and then you can't exit the policy. And I guess in this case, there's also decision traps, where companies get very excited and committed, both economically, but also emotionally committed, and perhaps also they've communicated with everybody, so reputationally committed to something. And offshore wind perhaps was that for REpower. Did you agree with that? In that it was already known then, and you were getting feedback from clients, yeah, I can't place orders, you're just not big enough. You're never going to be big enough in your current structure.
I don't think the offshore decision or the decision trap in offshore was the decisive factor of the fate of REpower's later called Senvion. It was, well, other decisions. But I fully understand what you mean looking back at other situations in my life, that you as a CEO or as a chairman or so, you have decided to go a certain way, to enter a certain market, to develop a certain product, and then you put first 10 million, then 100 million and more money into that. And when do you then admit maybe that was not the right direction? I've seen some examples of that also when you look at the wind industry today, ever-growing turbines. It worked for 20 years. The next generation was always better than the previous. But is that ever going to stop? And now decisions are taken differently. People in Western OEMs do not go in the usual speed to the next generation. And that's always hard. If you decided the next generation, and then suddenly to say, no, we don't do that race anymore. You know, why not? But it worked. So it's also an internal trap in yourself.
I reported to Matthias Schubert, a great friend, brilliant coach and a valued member of the team, one of the originators of wind turbine technology itself, actually. I remember asking him about floating offshore wind. I saw him at Wind Energy Hamburg just before COVID, I think. Floating offshore wind is coming. Matthias, what do you think? And his view, I think, was it's hard to see that that will be economically viable. Here we are today. Maybe he's right. It's hard to know yet, right? Because there's a lot of people still talking about it in the UK and in Japan and a few other places, but not yet got to utility scale project win. What's your view looking back around floating offshore wind and its prospects for today?
I can look back, what is it? Probably 20 years, because the very first floating offshore wind project was done by Siemens Wind Power, actually driven by our CFO, Chief Financial Officer. Our engineers said at the time, yeah, it's a fun project, but it will never be a big business. But we did a test project together with Equinor in Norway, and it turned out to be technically working extremely well. It's decommissioned in the meantime, but it was a very nice learning project. But that was nearly 20 years ago, and now we are here in 2026, and still we have a few test projects, but not a single fully project-financed commercial project. That has also to do with cost increases over the last few years, higher interest rates. So we thought maybe 5 years back, now it's there, it's soon there, but then also the negative effects that also affected bottom-fixed offshore started, and therefore floating is still floating away. But there are countries like, just like you said, Stuart, Japan, South Korea, they probably have no alternative if they want to get out of their fossil dependence, import dependence, and one day they will do it. When is that day? Still a question.
Would Sandbrook invest in floating offshore wind?
We wouldn't. Actually, I can very well say that.
I'm surprised how good.
No, it's easy to answer, Stuart, because we had invested into a Norwegian company that does installation vessels. And one of their additional businesses was a group of 10, 12 people developing floating offshore and to become a contractor in that business. And after, I think we analyzed it for a year and then closed that business because it didn't fit into the investment cycle and investment thesis of an infrastructure investor, which is looking for stable, predictable cash flows. And we could not, as Sandbrook, take the technology risk. Therefore, we exited it.
Other things that I think back to those REpower days is how it always felt very hard to have more than about 5 countries that were active markets at any one time. And you said it was always felt like electoral cycles determined whether there were subsidies in place, which you had maybe 3 years to then rush at those countries. Yep, offshore wind and onshore wind is favorable at the moment in that country. Are we ready? Is our grid compliance and everything ready? And we go. And knowing that there could be a government change in 3 or 5 years' time, and then we need to be ready to switch to another country. So that was always a brake on growth for the business. Do you recall what must have been that frustration of, I just wish everybody would agree?
But I think, Stuart, that's a general observation that still holds true for on and offshore. And it's true for all the companies that are in that business. There is a wave of projects in the US. Everybody runs into the US. Then suddenly Canada comes up in offshore. Taiwan was developing very, very nicely, demanding local production. Everybody rushes to Taiwan. Then suddenly you have France demanding factories and having projects, and then everybody goes into that country. And this is, I think, the overall problem that the wind industry has seen now for 20 years, these always changing cycles. Which are the 5 important countries? Which are the 5 important onshore countries, the 5 important offshore countries?
And which are the 5 at the moment? Because you know they're going to change.
They constantly change because a government changes, a policy changes. And the biggest example of that is, of course, currently the US administration, their attitude towards offshore. And that unfortunately prevented, in my view, the wind industry getting to a new and stable level of running a stable business. Instead, you always run these waves.
But arguably, one of the countries, a country which still is the second largest producer of offshore wind in the world, so I'm going to say something that you may not agree with, could have saved REpower, is if you had looked at investing in a factory in the UK for offshore wind, onshore wind, but particularly offshore wind. The UK still is one of the markets that's totally committed to offshore wind. course, there was always this, will you, the UK government, commit to work for us to invest in a factory? And it's not just REpower that needed that. Seemingly all companies have been reaching out. But I asked the question because, of course, in 2026, this is the year where for the first time, a company said, we will invest £1.5 billion into the UK to build a fully capable offshore wind factory, actually for floating offshore wind as well as fixed offshore wind, which was Mingyang from China. And in the end, the UK government said no for geopolitical reasons. I think a big mistake, but that's another subject for another podcast. But I guess my point is, do you look back and think, REpower could have made the brave decision to say, yeah, okay, we will either set up a new factory in the UK and position ourselves as uniquely, we're your partner of choice, or even could have somehow moved what was in Germany in those more difficult years when it was just which country is going to commit here, and moved it to Scotland. What's your view on that?
We never, and I never considered that we as REpower, with our maybe one offshore project every second year, should build a dedicated factory. A decent factory costs you 300 million, 500 million, with everything in. In order to be successful, you have to utilize it at least 75, 85%. Just calculate that is a few hundred turbines every year. And we as REpower could never have developed enough offshore projects for that purpose, which made an investment in any country.
And the truth is, the UK would never commit to fill that factory anyway. So it was always a risk. And that's what's interesting. Mingyang making this decision, our vision, if we go back to the Tulsi Tanti view of arms out wide, we don't need a short-term outcome. This is a long-term vision. So is that part of the issue, which is, let's call them Western companies, that have these short-term investment cycles, which are always going to make this kind of long-term gain type outcome unreachable?
Yes and no, because I think if when you run a normal Western company, sometimes stock listed, and most of them are stock listed, you of course have your quarter results, you have your annual results, and they drive many things that you do. But on the other hand, and I can compare that very nicely because I'm now in private equity, in these companies you still think long-term. What is my next generation turbine? How many years will I sell that turbine? Okay, we go from 2 megawatt, 3 megawatt at the time to 4, maybe 6. So you have an eternal thinking process.
So that's onshore.
Yeah, but also in offshore. If I build a factory, I don't build it just for that purpose. I need to use it for maybe 10, 20 years. Do I have a long lease on that? So I think most OEMs, at least the ones that I had the honor to run, think long-term. But of course, you have to translate that long-term into a business case, and that must have certain amortization times, payback times, returns. And that, of course, drives then what you do. By the way, that's very different in private equity. In private equity, you think basically I get in and I get out. When we were together at REpower, you didn't think I get out of my service business. You wanted to sign 20-year service agreements. That was our ambition, and it's still the ambition. So you think long-term, but have to convert that, of course, into annual results.
Are you an energy business looking to revisit your strategy? Did you know EIC's Consult team helped 50 businesses last year? How? We helped them with their strategic investment decisions using EIC's award-winning market intelligence and data to provide them with tailored, pragmatic BD strategies, presentations, and reports. It works. Our data and insights have helped customers to confirm their decisions to export, diversify, and grow. Contact us now to learn more about EIC Consult and begin your own journey to smarter decisions. Details in the description below.
Now we'll move on to kind of what happens next, which is you then went back to Siemens again. But you look back on those REpower days, and it's interesting because it's like a case in point of what a brilliant company, and ultimately it failed. How do you feel about that as a business, as a group of people, as an opportunity that in the end, through a series of business decisions, so was it the market or the business decisions, do you think, when you look back, that ultimately it led to the outcome, which is, the business failed?
I think it's clearly a decision thing. It has nothing to do with the market. And why do I say this? I say this in two ways. Again, take my REpower Nordex comparison. Nordex merged with Acciona, also did a very, very nice merger, merging German and Spanish culture into a successful company. We could have done that at REpower. There were several opportunities for REpower to do a similar thing, but we decided not to do so. It was under Suzlon, also under Centerbridge. So there were opportunities to get to the next level, just like Nordic. So it's a decision, not the market. Also, I think it's a sad example of cultures. You have a rock solid and admittingly financially not super clever German engineering wind turbine company called REpower, and you combine that with pure financial investors. And that combination in the end led to decisions that led also to the end of REpower. And this is for me an example of two cultures that might have not been merged in the best way.
You're definitely now, as I talk to you, reflecting on the kind of lessons learned. I know part of the work you're doing now is advising other companies on making good long-term decisions, but in the reality of today. You bring now all this expertise from your past experience. And I really like, you commented on a LinkedIn post of a past REpower employee, one of the many people like me who remember so fondly those days and is still kind of a bit sad that the company's still not there today. And you talk there about how you have to take accountability for the business decisions in the end. You can't blame anybody else. But also I like the fact that you sort of talked about you were doing due diligence on a project where there was a REpower turbine in there, was still 99% availability. I was like, yes. But all of us in the service business would be happy with that.
Yeah, but that in the end confirms we were a really good company at that time. Otherwise, these turbines that are recently looked at wouldn't be working that well. And the good thing is also many of the REpower people, and many, by the way, also of the good Siemens and Siemens Gamesa people, found new destinations in their life. So often these private or these personal careers are also delinked from the company situation of company outcomes. And good people still found extremely good jobs in many companies. Some of them became CEOs of good companies. Others run full engineering departments. Others run project departments. So one has also to split often between the people. And by the way, you are also a good example of that. You do a fantastic job now in a completely different life, but based on that knowledge, you are bringing your experience into this current role.
We're just a blend of our positive and negative experiences and the people we met along the way. There's a debate, I think, about whether you learn more from things that go wrong versus things that go right. And maybe that's another debate for another podcast. So, okay, what was the circumstances where you ended up going back then to the Siemens Wind business?
You say that elegantly. I was in between companies, and I got a call from, at that time, CEO of Siemens Gamesa, Markus Tacke, and he asked me, Andreas, would you fancy to come back to run the offshore business? And even before I knew my salary or anything, I said, yes, I would. Because I liked the company, I started the company, and running the very successful offshore business at the time was a wonderful thing for me. Working in Siemens, at that time Siemens Gamesa again, working with Danes. I have a Danish home still. I can combine that with Hamburg. It was a very nice step for me anyway.
This was about 2017.
I joined in November 2017.
Yeah, and then you went on to become CEO.
Yeah, that was then in 2020, a good 3 years later. We had an excellent time in offshore. We very profitable. And still till today, I think Siemens Gamesa have more than 60% of all offshore turbines in the world by these two companies, if you take out China. So a very successful business. And then there was the opportunity to run Siemens Gamesa as a whole company again. And
then it really got fun.
Nobody forced me to do that. I saw that a change might be coming. I went to our board and said, if you consider changing, I would like to have an opportunity. Be given the chance to do it again, if you think I'm the right person. That turned out in the end to be like that. So I became the CEO of Siemens Gamesa under admittingly extremely difficult circumstances. And if I say circumstances, COVID had just hit super hard, especially in Spain. We also had launched an onshore turbine that turned out to be not great. And we also had political and Siemens internal friction that really didn't make that life easy. And in that combination of COVID and other external effects like exploding supply chain and logistics costs of the Siemens internal things after the carve-out of Siemens Energy and our own decisions, again, I don't deny and I still argue it's mostly the decisions that you take. It was a super hard role.
What do you take from that time in terms of, is it again reflecting on could have done differently? There's always, I think, when you look back and you think, at the time I didn't see it, but now it's so obvious what I should have done.
First, to state it very clear, I do not regret that I went for it. It didn't have a fantastic outcome for me personally, and unfortunately also not for the company, but I don't regret it. So, of course, when you are in that situation and now looking back, there are a few things that I would do differently now. I would be way more rigid in take all that dust and noise away and drill down to the pure facts. And that's not always easy because what you consider facts is influenced by your emotions, by your decisions, by your empathy for people. But drilling down the facts in Siemens Gamesa now tells me we developed an onshore turbine that didn't work. And we allowed an organization to do that never developed such a turbine. Why did we not see it at that time? Why did we not use all the knowledge that we had? Siemens, and I say Siemens in that case, the Danish colleagues, had all the knowledge in the world. Why didn't we apply it? And that would be one learning. I would be way more drastic and not reflecting all the time, what does it mean for that organization, that site, what is the right thing to do, and then do it fast rather than consider and look and relook and so on. The other thing is also, and that you will probably see in your life, that is what I just described is what happens in the company. But there's also tons of stakeholders next to you or above you. There are owners, part owners. We were partly owned by Iberdrola at a certain time, had their own interest. We had Siemens AG, we had a board with lots of people. So who takes which decision?
This is back to, again, the REpower Suzlon messiness, right? Of ultimately who makes the decision and what's the driver of the decision. Gets in the way, it's just distracting.
Yeah, but also who is the official decision maker and who are the real people and whom do I need to inform, get on board. And if you are running especially such a difficult situation, you spend 24/7 on fixing your internal
issues instead of
spending your time with getting everybody on board, getting comfortable, admitting that things need to be reset and so on. But here and that is, of course, you're drowning in your day-to-day work. And in hindsight, I should have spent my time slightly different, but no time anymore.
Do you believe in this idea that culture is the most important element of a successful business, looking back? Or do you think ultimately it is, different cultures can work, it is about just good decision-making, honesty, and good people? What's your view?
Yeah, but that is for me one thing. And if you ask me, is it culture or the strategy? It's all about culture. The way we do things here is for me culture. And if you do them with a solid toolbox, the outcome will be solid.
Where did you learn that?
That is clearly coming from my Siemens days. And if I speak nowadays, I speak, you can imagine, to a lot of Siemens people, ex-Siemens people. This Siemens toolbox, and I'm sure you get the same good toolbox in other large corporations, is just a fantastic toolbox. And if you apply that properly, that determines your culture.
What is the Siemens toolbox? Can you explain what is that?
Decisions on projects, this LOA process of only submitting a fully and rock-solid offer to your customer and not hoping, we'll get to that cost level. No, you either have the cost under control or you don't.
So it's facts and it's honesty, accountability.
And then, so who is in charge here? And as soon as more than two people are in charge, for me, chaos starts. Then nobody's in charge. But also it's loyalty that you put, is a trust, loyalty. You put the company first and the whole company, not your division. And that was, in the end, all the debate we had in Siemens Gamesa. Even the name implies it. Is it now Siemens? We had this ugly word of it's Siemens legacy, it's Gamesa legacy. No, we are one company. And that is, in the end, determines your culture. Everyone should work for the fate and for the fortune of the whole company and not for the survival of your division, of your location, of your technology. And this is something that you learn in Siemens, I believe.
Okay, so let's now reflect on everything you've learned about the wind industry and bring it right up to date. The wind industry is once again suffering from fans and detractors. It's suffering from economic challenges, so headwinds, which supposedly are good for turbines, but economically definitely not good for turbines. What's your view right now, the future of wind? Is it got a good future from what you see and the people you talk to? Or are you worried that it's just not winning the capital market race at the moment?
The wind industry is part of this bigger green energy transition for me, and there we are just in the middle. We developed and we progressed very, very far, but due to difficulties in world economy, world politics, influences by individual politicians, we at the moment are standing on the fence or sitting on the fence. And we have two directions. Either we can fall back into a fossil history, hope that fusion comes, whatever, or we can continue and progress on the green energy transition. And there I think we have a different opportunity than we have in the past. In the past we were very much driven by climate change and fighting climate change. But due to the scale that this industry has achieved right now, we now can fight climate change, deliver very affordable energy, and just look at the situation we currently have in the world, resilient energy. Nobody can steal our wind. It's not imported energy, it's local energy. And that gives for me, if we continue and realize this triangle, this energy or renewable or wind triangle of fighting climate change, sustainability, or whatever you call that first corner, affordability, and then resilience, I think that gives a very new opportunity, and therefore I'm optimistic that we continue with electrification, with more renewables, and I think that is also the current tone you see overall in this industry, with all the hurdles that people see.
There are many, though, that I think would say that the wind industry is dominated by China now, and that there's a kind of deindustrialization happening in Europe and in the US, and indeed many US policies right now are fighting against the fear of deindustrialization. I think you could argue that's partly what's driving the Trump administration, is to try and reverse that trend. Should we be embracing Chinese technology and just accepting that if we really believe in wind, it doesn't matter who makes the technology, for the good of the climate, we should just import and use that technology so that it's affordable and can be used more readily? Or is it, no, we have to protect, it's a critical industry capability and the jobs and the skills in Europe have to be protected? Where do you come from? And when you're talking to people in your advisory role, what are you hearing about how decisions are going to be made in this regard?
First, I find it a super difficult decision. Not a politician, and also it's a difficult decision for me, having run 3 Western companies. What does that mean if not finally Chinese company take over that space? Would I like it? Would I not like it? So it's also personally not an easy positioning and decision to be made. But on the other hand, I believe we would not be in the current affordable energy situation had we not used China. Like, we worked with them the last few years. To give you a very practical example, as Sandbrook, we invested into an offshore installation vessel company called Hafram, located in Norway, and we needed 2 world's largest offshore installation vessels, and we ordered them in a Chinese shipyard. We would have not found a similar deal anywhere in the world. These are world-class vessels now. They have just been delivered this spring. They are installing their first turbines. They were on time, on budget, top quality. Would we have ordered them elsewhere? Probably not. So we need, on the one hand, the Chinese, and as you see currently in the wind industry, a typical wind turbine is 50%, a little bit less or a little bit more, anyway, out of Chinese components. And just the sheer economy of Chinese manufacturing drives down the cost. So it pays into that affordability advantage that we now have. What I find more critical is then that we are really building critical infrastructure. And that, of course, goes into this resilience point in my...
Do you mean resilience, or do you mean national security and national sovereignty?
Yeah, I think that would be, for me, be two elements of that, maybe of I run my own destiny in terms of I'm not dependent on gas imports, on any war in the Middle East and anything.
We're sitting here in Germany, which is 80% net energy importer. So
what choice do we have in Germany? We will never find more oil or gas, by the way. Then you have a negative climate effect. So
then I think it's something that's very current right now. So it's interesting to get your perspective on this. I think every country is thinking about this now, about energy security. But to me, it's energy sovereignty. It's what can we control within our borders in case there's a war, in case there's further disruptions to critical commodity supplies. But what's your view about what you're hearing again? Do you think in reality, it's a fake idea that we, as a country, we can be sovereign? Is it actually collaboration? Is it out to regional collaboration and back to the basics of know who your friends are, your trading partners are, know which technologies you think are critical to your national position, whatever that may be, protect that. And you have to protect, fund it, protect it, and then everything else, just know who your friends are and trade and trust and I guess hope that those routes of trust and trade stay open. So it's regional collaboration and trusted relationships. And what would that mean to something like the wind industry?
That would actually get me to three different aspects of that. First, it's then about European collaboration, the German envy. So it's clearly about the European cooperation, because you can look back, especially in these current days, at certain partnerships that we thought we have. And I say this with past tense. We thought we have a great relationship to Russia until the day it turned sour. We thought we have a great ally with the US. Big debate whether we have that or not have that. So the same situation we have with China. On the one hand, German industry wouldn't be where it is with China. So do we have an eternal or a permanent ally with China or not? Though you probably ask chancellors or presidents that are more qualified to answer that than I am. So that's a very difficult question for me to answer. If I boil that down to the wind industry again, or renewables in general, it is, in my view, about partnership, and that the industry hasn't developed as I would like to see it. The partnership between developers and the suppliers is still a very contractual, project-driven. They buy this, next time they buy that. We sell this to them and we sell. So it's not a permanent partnership to the benefit of both. And therefore, some years they win, some years the OEMs win. And that constantly changes.
But nobody's willing to make the leap either. They're like we talked about looking back in history, countries change in their policies. So how do you make a decision on who you can rely on? Everybody wants a short-term gain. There's a longer-term vision, whether it's a country needing to invest long-term, they're still subject to the short-term pressures. So you can see how in reality everybody ends up with this default position of, well, what's right for my country? I do that first. Do you feel like we're getting a fragmented and increasingly isolating world?
We clearly see that because we have this, I want my factory. And maybe especially in this post-globalization era, that's an understandable result that people fall back into that. I don't think it's the solution. It will be a short-term solution for one country, and then it's nice and going fine for a while. It's a relatively expensive electricity, and not everybody will then be open to import from just that country. So this isolation does not deliver the best financial result for the companies or for the countries in the long term, is my belief. I find that difficult, but still, you're of course right, Stuart, by saying we all fall into what's best for me. To give you a different example from my own history and easy to explain, there are currently there used to be 3 Western wind turbine companies dominating the space. Now it's only 2. Why don't they cooperate better? Defining certain standardization topics, Instead, they develop something in red, the other one in blue. And I know they are trying to cooperate, but in the end, it's not a full cooperation for the benefit of both of them or for the industry. And I've tried in my Sandbrook investor life a few times to bring that together and say, why don't you two, or it was also an onshore thing around transportation equipment, instead of you making all these different transportation equipments, just give it to an external party and focus on your core business. And then I really realized that these companies, but what's in it for me? Why should I do that now? I have already all of that. Why should I give it?
Decision trap.
Decision trap and
The emotional, economic, protectionist. It's hard to break out of it. You get criticized for flip-flopping from previous decisions, even though for the long term, it might be the right decision.
Yeah, and just to make very clear, I had the same problem when I was about to potentially cooperate with one of my competitors. And of course, I sat there, what's in it for us at the moment? Am I giving more than I'm receiving? And that is, of course, a very difficult decision. But on the other hand, I think, a fantastic European example, Airbus. Instead of having all these individual aircraft companies in the UK, in France, in Italy, in Germany, clever people at a certain time said, why don't we form just one world-class company? And here we are, 20, 30, 40 years after the foundation of Airbus, and it's clearly a world-leading company, having been formed out of people that surely fought against each other at the time. And this is what I mean, what I hope to see one day, that we live to that level.
So what does the future hold for you now then, as we reflect on this time, this critical time for, I guess you could say, net zero, and what that means to everybody now, the wind industry, fragmentation, decision-making, decision traps, policy traps, all the sort of things that we've talked about, all actually make a lot of sense in the world we're in today. So for you personally now, what does the future hold?
First, I'm personally very glad that I have been able to make that transition from a corporate life, from a CEO life, in what I would call portfolio life. You mentioned Sandbrook Capital. In addition to that, I'm in 2 boards of reputable companies, again, in green energy. I'm working with Bain & Company in consulting. So personally, I'm very glad, because that allows me to apply a lot of the learnings. Not very direct, because I'm not the guy running the company anymore, but indirectly working with good people, trying to make the best outcome for the company, or people that are the next generation people, helping them to strive and being successful. And that in a different combination of maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 different roles that complement each other. Overall, still in this, we are not yet there. We are still sitting on the fence. We need to continue in a different direction with this new triangle, but there's still a lot to do. I learned a lot. I'm normally still excited, maybe not 5 days a week, maybe we call it 4 days a week. There's also a day where I think, man, what are we wasting and how much time do we need to see the light? That is also true. But overall, I'm still energetic. I'm excited about that. I've been given this enormous opportunity, anything beyond I ever dreamed of when I was at university. And why don't I continue to work with mostly good people, people that want the right thing, clever people. So I continue to do that until I don't find the energy anymore. I don't see that day yet, but let's see.
Final thoughts from you then.
We are not yet there. And we see this fighting climate change. I think we are obviously not there. We see the effects every day. We don't have an affordable energy system for everyone. We have a very complicated, some days very expensive one. And it would be so nice to be protected against the chaos of the world by having an energy system that you own yourself, you determine yourself. So clearly not yet there. Luckily, there are plenty of good people that are still driving the world in the right direction. Yes, there are also some people who are more load than drivers, but luckily there are plenty of people that want the right outcome, and happy to work with them.
That's a nice way to think about it. If you're listening to this, are you a driver or are you a load? I hope I'm a driver.
I think most of the people, probably also that's how I select the people I talk to. I consider most of the people that I see, they are drivers. And it's super hard, actually, honestly, to...
What does it look like to be a load person?
First, you don't
name any names.
No, I will not. But also, I don't think you think yourself as a load, because you think yourself you're a driver, but in my view, you are driving in the wrong direction, and that's why you're a load. And of course, I've seen people and met people in my life fighting against wind, that it's ugly, that it's too expensive, all sorts of reasons against it. And I understand also these people. But I think the overall direction, for me at least, is very clear. And therefore, for me, defining who is load and who is driver is easy. Definitely, you are a driver doing the right thing, and most people that I have the honor to work with.
Andreas, it's been brilliant to see you. I have to say, one of my happy times in my career was when I worked at REpower as part of your business. So thank you for that. I know all the people that were part of that journey feel the same. And, we look back, don't we, in our careers and think about these times and think about what are the times where I learned a lot. So sometimes you feel like you learn a lot when it's going wrong, but I learned so much when it was going right, which REpower is part of my career when that happened. And do you advise people in terms of, career decisions, young people thinking about going into careers for the first time? What advice would you give?
Yeah, first, I do that, but on an informal basis. Like when there are people that I have a good chemistry with, I normally ask them lots of questions. What they want, where do you strive, why this, why that? Just so that they have a much, much deeper thinking process than the sometimes very superficial, it's a good career step, it reads nice in my CV and so on. I find it very important that if you dig much deeper in yourself. I'm not a professional coach, I just apply my common sense and empathy for these people. The main thing is always that I ask them for, you will strive where you have fun. Find the right people, because they determine in so many and direct way your fun. Working with people you don't synchronized with is an energy drain, fun is gone. So
a load.
Yeah, a load, yes, you're correct, Stuart. You can say this also.
Now I know what you mean.
It's not fun, and then you spend your valuable energy, rather than going forward, you spend that on trying to repair that or thinking about...
It's back to the distractions and...
Total distraction.
Not the Siemens way.
Yeah, but also in Siemens, and not everybody was fun. And you also have to find to the team there that you think is fun to work with. And that is, I think, the main thing. Because then you have all the energy to do the right things for your company. Will you always find that? I'm sure, Stuart, you found a situation in your life where it was not fun to go to work every day. I had that clearly also at a certain time. And then you have to make your decision. Do you hang in? Do you try to change it? But that is then your life, my life.
Yeah, I think younger people listening to this, they sometimes don't realize that very senior people like you have bad days too, right? And have difficult situations to deal with.
There were two situations in my life that were super interesting. When I was CEO of Siemens Gamesa, Spanish hierarchy is zip.
From a podcast point of view, nobody saw what you just did.
Yeah, that is super hierarchical. And vertical. It's very interesting. If you say, for me, Spanish hierarchy is super hierarchical. It's absolutely
from top down.
It's only top down. Danish hierarchy is totally flat. There is no top. Everyone is equal. And the German, I think, is somewhere in between. But I visited, like I did in all my companies, we had meet the CEO, whatever we call that, meet the CEO, lunch with the CEO. And I met then with people in Pamplona from ex-Gamesa, at that time Siemens Gamesa. And there was a very experienced person sitting next to me, and he said, Andreas, you're the first CEO in 27 years in this company that I meet in person. I said, that cannot be. You had plenty. Yeah, but no CEO ever came into a meeting room with me and asked me how I'm doing. What do you realize now? That you're just a very normal person. And this is, I think, also the way I used to work, Stuart, when you and I worked together. I tried to be close to people because you learn so much. And that was actually when I was asked to leave Siemens Gamesa. 1.5 years of hard work, still not successful the way I wanted it. But I think we started the right things, but still I had to leave. But I had made one decision. I had about 4 weeks to hand over to my colleague, my successor, and I traveled to various sites with him. You can imagine what an interesting week that was. Handing over to your successor after you got asked to leave, you got fired. Okay, I managed. But then I decided on the day that I leave, I will walk out the front door. I will not quietly disappear. Front door is my exit. And we then had an all-employee meeting. I think 8,000 of our 25,000 people participated. And I remember, of course, as you can imagine vividly, I was sitting in Denmark, other people were sitting in Spain, and it was then explained. And we had all these usual corporate explanations of why that change, and thank you, Andreas, and so on. And then at a certain time I said, can I please explain it myself? And I decided I explained it my way. I was sad that it didn't have the right outcome for the company, but that I was convinced that we have good people, that I did the right things. And I wish you all the best, dear successor. Then I walked out the front door. And what was super exciting, as you can imagine, I was a little down that afternoon and not thrilled. And then my wife suddenly opens LinkedIn. And my wife was, of course, also disappointed. She saw how much energy I put into that. Then she said, look at these posts in LinkedIn. And they were very, very similar to what you said. Loyal to the company, he did the right thing, said that you're leaving. And in the end, I think there were more than 300. I stopped reading them. I couldn't take that anymore. But that was, for me, a lot of confirmation that I tried the right things. Because when you sit in this company, I sometimes sat in my office COVID time, don't these people get that we are in deep, deep trouble and we need to do things differently? How often shall I explain that? And a day too late, I got all the confirmation that my explanations ended with the right people. We were not fast enough to turn the ship around, and the company is still working on that. So, but still, I recall that day.
Andreas, thank you so much. It's been really lovely to see you, and you're a brilliant podcaster.
Thank you, Stuart.
Well, that's our show for today. A huge shout out to Samara, Lucas and Joao and the rest of our incredible team behind the scenes. This show truly wouldn't happen without them. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would mean the world if you'd hit that follow button, give a 5-star rating or leave a review. It's the best way to help us keep doing what we love. And as a thank you, I'll leave you with my favourite 5-word joke. Love wind power. Big fan.